Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine. Just so everyone knows, you can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. For show notes, you can subscribe to our Substack at B5VSDS9.substack.com. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either Babylon 5, DS9, this show, or anything else you'd like us to tackle, then leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or another podcatcher. Take a screenshot of your 5-star review and email the screenshot and your question to us at noticeapattern b5vsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future. If you have any ideas of material or stuff you'd like us to cover for bonus episodes, please email us at, again, b5vsds9@gmail.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine. This is Bob from Cascadia. I got Matt from the Southland on the line. How you doing today, Matt?
Not doing too well. I'm on the tail end of some bronchial issues, but hopefully I will make it through this episode alive.
Yeah, you sound like death warmed over, but that's your commitment to the listeners. You might not be here for episode 6, but you're still here for episode 5, giving it to the listeners.
Yeah. I've had a good bit of time to watch these shows and get to know the characters a little better.
Yeah. All right. So today we're discussing both the Star Trek DS9 episode Dax, which I believe is episode 9 of season 1, although I have not double checked that. It aired on February the 13th, 1993. And then we're also talking about episode 3 of season 1 of Babylon 5, Born to the Purple, which aired about a year later on February 9th, 1994. Let's see. Matt, did you want to start off with the plot summaries of the two main plots for Dax, such as they are?
Sure. Collation security personnel attempt to actually abduct Jadzia Dax to stand trial for the murder 30 years ago of a famous general and a good friend of her previous host, Curzon Dax. After thwarting that abduction, Sisko must try to prove that the separateness of Curzon and Jadzia in this extradition hearing. You all also have to forgive me. I'm on steroids right now, so my brain is a bit in a fog. But
yeah, I mean, that's a hell of a thing, roiding for a podcast, man.
Yeah, roiding out for this podcast. Yeah, it's very, very philosophical episode of whether or not Dax and the host, the Trill host, are one and the same being, or if they're separate.
Yeah, great. And we'll talk about this a little more in the conclusion of our podcast episode today, but I did want to frame a couple of things first, because it's really kind of interesting, because you've got two different metaphysical questions going in this trial, at least as like Sisko is bringing it up, because the whole thing is these security personnel were trying to extradite Dax, but they tried to do it on a Bajoran space station where they don't have any extradition agreements with Bajor. And Sisko and Kira, in a kind of very charming two-step, they set up a thing where it's like, okay, well, you have extradition agreements with the Federation, but not with Bajor, so we have to do this hearing. And just as a side note, that was a sort of interesting thing, because, in very recent episodes of the podcast, we saw Kira and Kira and Cisco not working well together at all, particularly in episode 3 of Deep Space Nine, past prologue. There's a lot of tension about like the different potential interests of Bajor and the Federation. But here you see Cisco and Kira kind of effectively tag teaming the security personnel who've come for Dax. So that was a kind of neat side note, I thought. But the interesting thing was the 2 metaphysical questions of identity that Cisco raises in the extradition hearing about Dax, and Matt already hinted at some of these. The first one is, can you think of Jadzia Dax, Dax and its current host as morally or legally the same person as Curzon Dax? That is, can like Jadzia Dax be held legally or morally accountable for what Curzon Dax did? And then the second question of identity is, even if Curzon Dax did commit the murder that he's accused of and has a warrant out for, the question is, do you blame the composite entity that is Curzon Dax, or do you just blame the host Curzon, or do you blame the Dax symbiote? And obviously how you answer that question might have some influence on how you answer the first question, but it was just a sort of interesting and complicated thing there. Do you have any thoughts on that, Matt?
I've watched this episode several times, and going back to it for this is probably the 3rd or 4th time I've seen it. You really get an understanding of this is the first time you really get an understanding of how the symbiote itself, the Dax symbiote, actually is a part of the Trill. And Jadzia gets the choice at a young age on whether or not she actually wants to accept a symbiote or not. I thought that was interesting, just getting to knowing that was her choice to have that done. It's not just something that's forced upon them upon reaching a certain age. And then you get to know a little bit more about how their memories are combined. She has all the memories of Curzon Dax, but at the same time, everything that she has done up to the point before taking the symbiote, like she learned all these different types of sciences. She lists a long list of them. You remember?
Yeah, like xenoarchaeology, xenobiology, I think were 2 of them.
Right. She has all of those different. She's done all those other things prior to taking the symbiote into herself. So she has a personality and something of her own there. It's not just Curzon Dax inside a different body.
Yeah. There were 2 things I kind of wanted to build on that you brought up there that were interesting. The first was the idea that because one of the witnesses the prosecution brings in, even though they're essentially not a prosecution because it's just a hearing, but one of the witnesses the prosecution brings in to get Dax extradited is a Trill government minister. And he has this sort of interesting conversation, kind of pursuant to what you were saying about how the Trill's host and symbiotes aren't joined until the host is in their earlier mid-20s. And it was like the purpose of that is to allow the host to kind of develop a separate identity and the separate skills that you were talking about, which is a sort of interesting concept. So it's not like a overriding situation. It is supposed to be like an actual synthesis. And then the only other thing I wanted to hit on there, which I thought was interesting, was this sort of interesting idea that they do make getting the Trill symbiote like very much a sort of meritocratic, like rat race thing, right? Like Cisco really presents Jadzia as like this overachiever. She's she's got all these degrees. She's the best of the best. And I think that's something, it's been a few years, but I think that's something that shows up in later episodes that feature the Trill too. It's not all Trill are joined with the symbiotes, and getting a Trill symbiote, you do have to be like top of the class at the Ivy League school or whatever. So there is an interesting like kind of rat race component to trying to get a Trill symbiote.
I think that later on, I think they do mention that again, future seasons. I know that later on when Ezri Dax shows up, you get a sense of that as well.
Yeah. And like Ezri's interesting precisely because she's one of the Trill who like never was trying for symbiote. It had no interest, but because of circumstances, she's forced to take it on because there's no other Trills available. So yeah, it's a sort of interesting spin of like the Jadzia's elite skills and like working her entire life to quote earn the Dax symbiote versus it just kind of falling into Ezri's lap.
And a cool thing too about this episode, I was glad we revisited it, was that the recent inclusion of the Trill in Discovery, it acted as a refresher on what they're about and
yeah, that's a good point, because Trill characters have been an important part of season 3 of Discovery, and I knew that, but I wasn't really actively thinking about it till you just said it, and I didn't take the time to go back and look at Discovery because it's been a few months. So if I had had the time / had remembered, that would have been an interesting thing to do. But yeah, it is a kind of good setup for what Discovery is doing with its couple of Trill characters. Oh, one last point I wanted to make. So basically, to keep the spoilers mild, like the sort of trial scenario you're having here is kind of like a Long Black Veil scenario, if people know that old country song, where it's Dax doesn't want to exculpate herself, or himself in the past, because doing so would implicate someone else. And so in that way, you have a sort of interesting spectacle of like Sisko and Bashir and even Major Kira to an extent making this sort of big show at the extradition hearing, like talking about like who and what Jadzia is and who and what the Dax symbiote is. And even though there's a plot reason for her to be so passive and to not really weigh in, it does almost give it a subtext of like Jadzia sort of disapproves of how Sisko and Bashir are presenting her case, because to make the case to defend her, to prevent her from being extradited, like both Sisko and Bashir especially are having to basically argue that like she's morally and legally separate from both her prior host and from the Dax symbiote itself. And they're really trying to stress her identity as like, just Jadzia, plain and simple Jadzia. And it seems like that might be something Jadzia would probably strongly disagree with. I mean, certainly her like actions in this episode to, remain silent and risk her life in order to protect an old friend, like that does seem to already say that like, even if she doesn't think of herself exactly as Curzon Dax, she still thinks of herself as taking on Curzon's feelings and obligations. Yeah, so I just thought that was like an interesting subtext that like obviously Sisko and Bashir are working for what they perceive to be Jadzia's best interests, but in so doing, they're maybe having to really travesty what she actually is a little bit, and like to describe a version of Jadzia that Jadzia wouldn't embrace.
Yeah, and that kind of also raises the question too of like how much control does the symbiote actually have over the host? Like in that sense, she is defending someone else from Curzon's past. They're trying to keep, and it doesn't. I don't know if I'm just trying to if I put myself in Jadzia's shoes, I would probably want to say something, but having Curzon as a part of me, it's just completely like, I guess would change that. But how much control does that symbiote actually have over the way she thinks and her personality?
Yeah, and I mean, I think my answer, and again, I'll reference that novel I referenced last time, A Memory Called Empire, which deals with it's a kind of cool space opera about an ambassador who's comes from a space station where personnel is short, so they implant the memories of the prior person who had your job into you, so you can draw on their experience, their knowledge, and the emphasis of the culture in that space opera novel, Memory Called Empire, is that this isn't like a taking over or taking control. It's an integrative thing. So the idea is that like, oh, you integrate your predecessors in your work. You're not just like taken over, overwritten by them. And so in that sense, I think I would really want to defend the idea that I kind of against Sisko and Bashir, that there isn't a separation of Jadzia, Curzon, and Dax. Like it's one entity that just takes new forms. So in that sense, I would argue that I don't think Jadzia feels it as a separate thing, if that makes sense. Like I said, I don't love that episode, but it does raise a lot of really kind of interesting philosophical questions. So I'm glad we got to talk about it. And like you said, it gives us good backstory for future appearances of the Trill in Deep Space Nine and even in Discovery Season 3. So let's see. We'll pivot to Season 1, Episode 3 of Babylon 5, Born to the Purple, which again aired in February 94. And whereas Dax was sort of giving us this introduction to Trill culture, even though we already had seen a Trill character in Star Trek The Next Generation, Born to the Purple is probably giving us our first big glimpse into Centauri culture through the character of their ambassador on Babylon 5, Londo. And we see Londo get entangled with a Centauri dancer while Commander Sinclair is trying to wrangle him for talks about something with the Centauri's rivals, the Narn, here represented by Ambassador Jakar. And while that's going on in the A plot, in the B plot, we have Chief Garibaldi trying and failing to enlist Lieutenant Commander Ivanova to track down a rogue transmission on a sensitive channel. So what did you take away from Born to the Purple, Matt?
Interesting note, just from the very beginning of the episode, they're talking about the Euphrates sector. Once again, I don't know what it is with science fiction and like rivers, but apparently that's like a common theme.
Yeah, well, it kind of fits into some of the other names of Babylon 5, right? Like Babylon, Euphrates.
Right, yeah. But yeah, they're trying to come up with a Centauri Narn agreement, and Londo is just way too invested in this dancer by the name of Nadira to be a part of that. You get your first look at what Centauri females look like, which is actually it's very interesting. They're bald, but with a ponytail, which just the hairstyles for the Centauri are just, I guess, unique. Nadira is actually played by an actress by the name of Fabiana Udinio. And for those of you, if you need reference on who she actually was a lot of the China in Austin Powers. The girl that was in the hot tub when Austin Powers decides to break wind, and she goes, "How dare you break wind before me?" So I knew I recognized her. I just couldn't think of where from, so I pulled up. Yeah, she was recently in the show Jane the Virgin, which is on Netflix. But
the English remake, I assume, not the Spanish original.
Yes, the English remake. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this was a very weird episode. It's a lot of strange things that happened. That a lot of sexual tension with Londo and the Centauri. And you learn a lot about the Centauri, just how they there's a slave class, which is Nadira is part of that. She's actually has a master by the name of like Dracus, who looks like the performer Meatloaf if he was a pimp. Basically Dracus wants this purple file that Londo has been keeping, and in that purple file there's all this different information that can be used against other people, and he wants to take it. And apparently the Centauri are built upon using blackmail and bribery and all that kind of stuff.
So we learned quite a bit about the Centauri Republic in this episode, and it seems to mostly be an oligarchy controlled by a small amount of aristocratic families who compete for status and prestige and power via blackmail. And it seems like reputational politics and status are a big part of the Centauri power structure. We hear Londo allude to that a couple of times. And so it kind of builds in a recipe for a lot of hypocrisy with, you sort of back dealing of the elite Centauri families, but also like they're trying to maintain like a wholesome, patriotic public face. And we also get the sense that the Centauri are a pretty thoroughgoing slave society. It seems like if your family falls from power, or if it just didn't have power to begin with, you can wind up enslaved, which is what happened to Adira. So in that way, it's sort of interesting that her sleazy-looking meatloaf pimp is trying to use the Centauri slave system against the system, so to say. But yeah, so it's kind of like with the episode Dax and Trill culture. We get a kind of interesting start at a look into the Centauri culture here. And then Another notable thing that came up is we get introduced to two new characters. We get introduced to the assistants to the ambassadors. So we have Veer as the assistant to Ambassador Londo, and then we have Kodath as the assistant to Ambassador Jakar. And it's interesting, like Veer is going to continue to be a somewhat important part of the show, or at least a regular part of the show from what I've seen. And then on the other hand, apparently the actress who played Kodath just really hated the makeup required to play an Narn character. So she gets replaced by a different Narn aide, I think in the very next episode. It is they both at least the functions of the assistant to the Narn ambassador and the assistant to the Centauri ambassador, and indeed the assistant to the Minbari ambassador will continue to be an important part of the show. Did you have any thoughts on Veer or Kodath, Matt?
They're both just comical characters, honestly. Just the teeth from the Narn character. Just, she's always showing her teeth when someone says something that she disagrees with. And then you had the Centauri character. Say his name again one more time. It's
Veer.
Veer. There we go. Veer. I'm trying my best to keep up with everybody. Veer, at one point, he keeps playing this electronic game. And it's so bad too, because I recognize the game from my childhood. It's actually Aladdin from the Tiger Electronics thing. And you can actually see where they like just glued stuff onto it.
Yeah.
Making sure they could cover everything up. It was funny. But yeah, he's very childish, I guess, is what they're trying to go for. But
yeah, definitely kind of playing up him as being like immature and inexperienced, excuse me. Yeah. And then there wasn't much to say about the B plot of the episode, but I did want to ask, particularly since Lieutenant Commander Ivanova's backstory in episode 2 seemed to be really interesting for you. I was just sort of curious if this final conversation with her father, like, did that add anything to your sense of Ivanova as a character, where they're going with her history with her mother as a telepath?
Yeah, I mean, it added another layer, because I guess her father disagreed with her joining the Earth Force from the get-go. But with this episode, you find out that he's actually extremely proud of her, and he admits he was wrong. Although I wasn't really, I like the B plot. I like the whole thing that happened. But Garibaldi, his response at the end bothered me. He says, I just couldn't really tell if he was being nice about calling what was going on a computer error, and when he says that it won't, but he implies that it won't happen again. I mean, how did you feel about that? Like,
so to answer that, I guess I'll say it's something that's kind of interesting about Babylon 5 in general, is it just seems like, unlike Star Trek, in the world of Babylon 5, like scarcity is a much bigger deal. Like we'll see this in a couple episodes, I think, that are coming up soon in season 1, of like characters having to pay a lot of money to get like certain food or certain liquor shipped in. We sort of saw that, I think, in the TV movie The Gathering, where the prior XO, Lieutenant Commander Takashima, is like illicitly growing coffee. I can't remember if it's in her quarters or in like the botanical gardens, but she's like kind of gives some to Dr. Kyle, but it's like telling him to keep secret. And so just in general, it's like, it seems like Babylon 5's universe, as far as I can tell, still does seem to operate on some sort of, recognizably capitalist logic, but it also just seems to have a lot more like resource constraints, and, shipping things out to the station Babylon 5 is hard. Like getting the energy for certain transmissions is hard. And so just that context of scarcity in Babylon 5 is interesting, whereas in Deep Space Nine, like, and the rest of the 24th century Star Trek, at least, like the implication is that the replicator can, handle everybody's basic needs and quite a bit of their basic luxuries as well. So it just kind of it points to like the sort of two different economic and political contexts of the different shows.
For anyone confused about what we're talking about, basically, Ivanova is using she's making a long distance call in a sense. Like,
Yeah,
you want to go early '90s, and
yeah.
she's using what's called the Gold Channel to talk with her father, who is on Earth. Garibaldi is trying to figure out who's making these calls.
Yeah.
And
Ivanova's running up the phone bill for the station.
of course, like the other thing too is after this conversation, after Garibaldi listens to the conversation, he immediately asks her to go out for a drink. I'm like, what, really? Like, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but I mean, that's just like it doesn't resonate with me.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be more of like a friendly drink, like let's go out for a drink. You're my friend. You had a hard thing. I want to support you. But given
Yeah,
that Garibaldi is such like a horn dog, like
right.
yeah, it can kind of read more as like oh well, I've got one on you, and so I'm going to suborn you into this, and that yeah,
Yeah,
that's pretty that is pretty sleazy.
it
Which
came up kind
actually
of creepy.
does. Speaking of '90s sleaze, it does pivot us into what'll probably be a regular feature on the show, which is Horny Watch. Who's thirsting for it on Babylon 5 and DS9 this week, Matt?
So yeah, after watching several episodes of these shows, you realize that there were just so many horrible, just sexual remarks made by the male characters to women. They come out of nowhere. So we decided this is probably something we want to point out how TV has changed today compared to what it was in the '90s. So this is what comes out of Dr. Bashir's mouth in like the opening parts of the episode. He's talking to Dax. They're discussing some issues with the replicator, and he says, "I can think of better ways of keeping you up, better than Klingon coffee." And
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah. It's rough. And at
yeah,
least
like,
we do, at least we are treated to the repeated spectacle of Bashir getting shot down in the episodes we've seen. Like Dax and
right.
Kira both shoot him down in the pilot. His attempts to woo the Bajoran woman, and I believe that was in Q less, or no, maybe it was past prologue. Don't go anywhere. His attempts to woo Bash don't go anywhere thanks to Q. So at least
Yeah.
we do get Bashir shot down. But yeah, it's pretty cringe.
And then the female Narn is literally on the show for like 10 seconds. And this random guy just comes up to her and goes, let's blow this joint and play a little Scan the Sector. I mean, it's just bad. Just
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, a lot of really bad pickup
Creepy.
lines that either border on or go into sexual harassment.
Yes.
Yeah, not great, not great. Although it is sort of interesting that we're continuing on DS9 to have this sort of like low key Bashir Quark Dax triangle. One of the reasons that the security forces don't succeed in kidnapping Bashir is that Bashir was being a creep and trying to meet up with Dax again.
Right.
And then also like Odo attempts, although he unsuccessfully, but he attempts to kind of use Quark's feelings for Dax to pressure him into using Quark's bar as the site for the hearing, since it's the only place suitable on the station for a hearing.
Yeah, that was so odd. Like, there's no conference room or anything on the station they could have this thing in. They had to like clear out Quark's bar.
I mean, in a weird way, it's a sort of nice homage to like old Western movies. Like if you watch like an old John Ford, John Wayne Western, I'm thinking like particularly like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance from 1962, you'd have this thing where it's like you have to turn the bar into a courtroom because it's like you're on the frontier. You don't have many buildings. You don't have like a designated like courtroom or designated city hall yet. So in that way, it was a kind of nice kind of nod to that sort of tradition in Western films and movies. I think they do that in Deadwood too. If I remember right, after Wild Bill Hickok gets shot, they hold the trial in the gym, which is Al Swearengen's saloon and brothel on the show.
Does it have something to do with the Cardassians though, like the way they run things? That maybe they
Oh,
just
that's a
don't have
good
that type of
point.
setup.
Yeah, that's a good point because I hadn't thought about that. The Cardassians are such such authoritarian sort of state power oriented people that they don't really have the need to build like large public rooms, right, where you could have like a hearing or a trial or
Right.
any sort of like like station meeting. Like that's just not something in the kind of Cardassian character to do because of the way they structure their society. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Nice, nice. So with Thirst Watch concluded, I think we wanted to kind of close out by talking a little bit about how we could connect this episode to some other famous Star Trek episodes with legal proceedings. I think we were specifically thinking of the Drumhead from 1991, which is a Next Generation episode about kind of like paranoia and McCarthyism and witch hunting. And then there's a later Voyager episode from 1996 called Death Wish, where Q2 is petitioning Captain Janeway for his right to die. He's tired of being an immortal being. He wants a right to die. And then I think most directly, and this is something we both jived with, is that Dax, the episode, seems to be trying to imitate the Next Generation episode Measure of a Man from 1989, which, I mean, in some ways, if you wanted to be really harsh, like Measure of a Man is like the first good Next Generation episode. It comes maybe midway in season 2. And I think it's the first time you really get a sense of like, oh, this show could be something. It's not just this kind of unfortunate retread of the original series. But I don't know. I don't think we, even though I think we thought the connections were interesting, I don't think we really thought that the episode Dax measured up to the episode Measure of a Man. Did you want to weigh in on that some, Matt?
Yeah, it didn't measure up as well to measure to Measure of a Man. While there were still some of the philosophical implications there, I just didn't. It really made you think, both episodes, of course, really make you think about sentience and how it what is considered sentient and all that kind of stuff. But I think Measure of a Man covered it much better. And I agree with you. I agree with what you said earlier, that I think Measure of a Man is probably the first episode of the Next Generation where you do say, okay, this is something I can get behind. This show could be something more than what it's done to this point. And we see that for other episodes. There are much better episodes in Next Gen later on that kind of follow through with that.
Yeah, and I think to me the big difference between Measure of a Man and Dax is that in Measure of a Man, like you're dealing with like the philosophical status of Data, who's like a unique being, right? Like there aren't really any other Soong type androids like him, or like the ones they are like Lore or B4 later are kind of like very different than Data. So like you're dealing with like Data's legal rights in that episode almost as like a singularity. Whereas it's kind of weird, even though like you can appreciate why you would want to use the courtroom thing to introduce like the concepts of the trill and the sort of join consciousness. You can see why you'd want to use that as a form to introduce it to the audience, but it just doesn't make as much sense because it's like trills are like members of the Federation, right? Like they're Jadzia Dax is not the only example of a Dax host. Like surely other conjoined trills
Right.
are murdered. Like
Right. There's surely like be laws in place. Like I agree. Yeah. Like this is not something brand new. It's not a brand new species or anything. This is something. This is a group of people who've been around for a while.
Yeah. So, and on that level, it's just, I think a bit more unsatisfying where, I mean, you can maybe make the same complaint about Measure of a Man, which is like, Data's been in Starfleet for, something like 15 years at the time that episode takes place. Like, shouldn't they have figured this out before now, sort of thing? I don't know. I feel like it's more pressing in Dax. And it's also just, it's a little frustrating because it's like you basically get the Bajorans and the humans and the other species whose name I'm blanking on, like arguing over what the trill is or are. And you don't like, you have two trill characters, like both the minister from the government and you have Dax. And they don't really ever actually very much say like how they think of themselves. And so in that way, it's sort of frustrating, right? You would think that, I don't know, you would think like the Trill would pretty much have like a pretty easy stock response for this. Whether that would stock response would help or hurt Jadzia, I'm not exactly sure. But
Right, and I think doesn't one of them say that they've been through eight different? I don't know what the right word is, but eight different cycles.
eight
Like
host.
eight hosts, yeah, they've been through eight hosts. So, like, I mean, you're right. You would think they would know at that point because there's at least probably roughly like 800 years, close to 800 years there of just for that one character that we don't know much other than anything else about.
Yeah, because I think I can't remember the number of prior hosts of the Dax symbiote, but maybe it's six. And I know we're very specifically told that the Dax symbiote is 600 years old. I think,
Mm-hmm.
or about 600. And then yeah, the minister, it seems like he might be a bit older than that still.
Yeah, I think it was eight, but this just seems like a long period of time for them not to be able to just define what they are.
Yeah, and one other thing I think is a kind of interesting connection, but also maybe kind of a failure of the episode Dax a little bit is that point I was making early about Cisco, where you could see the case he's making to defend Jadzia might in some way discomfort Jadzia. You could almost compare that with the way in Measure of a Man, like Riker is forced to be the one arguing against Data's rights as a sentient being, where it's not his choice, but he's been conscripted or drafted into doing it. And so there's a sort of interesting parallel there with, even though Cisco is, doing a much more positive thing, like that sort of disconnect of like having to kind of betray your friend a little bit that's a tension that's present in both episodes. Although I think ultimately that's the other reason Dax doesn't work as well as Measure of a Man as an episode, is that in Measure of a Man, you have Picard and Riker going against each other as the lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
which is much more interesting than Cisco going against, this random guy who's way too personally involved in this case,
Right.
from the alien world.
So let me ask you this: if like they didn't write the ending the way they did, and there wasn't that last bit of evidence that comes into play, would you have blamed Curzon? And what would you have done? What would you have decided if you were in the bench?
I think the answer has to be that I think the answer has to be that Curzon Dax is only liable for the murder as long as Curzon Dax is an entity. And when Curzon Dax ceases to be an entity and it becomes, a Jadzia Dax or an Ezri Dax or a Harry Dax or, whatever, like, I don't think you can justify holding the new, even though I think I'm a big proponent of there is no separate Jadzia, there is no separate Curzon. Once they are joined, they're joined. But I still don't think you can hold the new entity created by the joining legally or morally responsible for the crimes of an old host. And we're going to sort of see this again with the Dax symbiote. I don't remember the details precisely, but it's going to come up again. And it seems like it sort of go in that episode. If I remember, it's like, I think it's the host who does the crimes is blamed, not the Dax symbiote itself. It'll be interesting to revisit that future episode in the light of this, because it may be, I don't know, maybe they align, or maybe there's some tension.
I agree. Once I feel like once the symbiote left Curzon, was placed into Jadzia, it was there's no liability there.
Yeah, and I mean, this is maybe a fraught thing, but like, I'm a big believer in statute of limitations, potentially even for murder. Like,
yeah,
I mean, if like, a 30, 40-year-old murder, that's like that's a little fraught to my mind. I mean, obviously one does not want to encourage murder or people getting away with murder, but
and I feel like it would be different too, though, if, like, let's say if the Dax symbiote, if Curzon went and committed the crime, and then immediately switch host.
Yeah,
that would be something different. But I don't think that's not a possibility. It's not like Venom and Spider-Man. It's not like you could latch onto someone else and it'd be like that. It's a much more complicated process.
I think that's a good counterexample, but I would respond that I still don't think the new host could be held legally responsible. But I would say though that there is a second issue, which is the issue of how much the new host does present a danger to others. So, like if Curzon Dax had done the murder and the Dax symbiote was in some sense unrepentant, and there were clear and concerning signs that like the new host, like Jadzia Dax, might kill again, I think that's a different issue to me. So it's like I would want to. I think there's the issue of like legal and moral responsibility, which I think the new Dax host, I don't think you can hold them to that. But then on the other hand, there is the issue of like, would this new entity pose like a present danger to people in society, and that's a sort of separate question and not to be adjudicated separately from whether they're responsible for the original murder.
What are we looking at next week?
Oh man, I honestly don't know. I think is it the Nagus episode for Deep Space Nine? Is that up next? I think
next week we're looking at Nagus and Infection.
Great. Well, looking forward to talking with you then, Matt. This has been Bob from Cascadia, and I got Matt from the Southland on the line, and this has been Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for listening.
And remember, you can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. For show notes, subscribe to our Substack, b5vsds9.substack.com. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either show or anything else you'd like us to tackle, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or another podcatcher. Take a screenshot, email that screenshot to us with your question at b5vsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future, so if you have any ideas of stuff you'd like to see for bonus episodes, email us at b5vsds9@gmail.com.